Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dolby Vision webinar. We're in California today, broadcasting to you. And here in California, it's April 23rd. Where you are, it may already be April 24th. So welcome to all of our friends in Asia Pacific region. As the announcement just said, everyone is muted. Text chat is probably not going to be used. If you have questions, please ask them in the questions tab at any time, and we will see them. They may or may not be published, but we do want to hear your questions, so please keep them coming. That's the place to enter them. And we will be recording this session, and it will be made available to you after the session. So we've already done one earlier this morning here in Los Angeles, California, and we're on our second version. It's the same exact webinar content. Of course, the questions and the interactions may be different. So we're looking forward to that. And you'll notice there's another tab in the control panel that allows you to download two handouts. So one of them is the Color Grading Best Practices version 4.2. That is new as of today. And the other is the actual slides from this webinar, so that you can have the slides as well. All right, so next slide, if we could, Avi, and I'll just introduce everybody quickly. So my name's Tom Graham, and I work here in Los Angeles, mainly enabling post facilities and studios to create Dolby Vision content. I work hand in hand with the other folks on this call, A.B. Matthew, who's our senior staff engineer, and he's going to help train you on all of the Dolby Vision best practices today. And then Gavin Wang is our product manager. He helps create the Dolby Vision software integration kit that goes out to the partners, and they then integrate it into their product. And he also manages the Dolby Vision Professional Toolkit. We also have Greg Hamlin, who is our Dolby Master Colorist and has helped out on many different shows, and also helps with training. So we're glad to have Greg on board today. And then we have Ellis Reed, who is our senior marketing manager, who's helped coordinating and making this whole webinar run and doing all the invitations. So thanks to everybody, and we'll get started. So let's look at the agenda quickly. The purpose and the goal for this webinar was to essentially try to cover the most common questions and the most common errors that we see when a post house is creating a Dolby Vision title. And so we picked basically 6 topics to help run you through. If you have questions, etc., if the topic's not on here, we're happy to see that or to try to address it. Please let us know. And we'll also leave time at the end for the Q&A process as well. All right, so let's get started. We'll jump in on the first topic, which is the timeline working space, and including before each section where we have updated the guidance inside that version 4.2 color grading best practices. So this is from chapter 2.2, updated guidance on color grading. Previously, when we talked about the timeline working space, we had the guidance that we recommended that you work in PQ as your timeline working space. And we've now updated the guidance that there are many acceptable color pipeline workflows for the timeline in color corrector, but you have to specifically set the output color space to 2084 PQ and either P3, D65, or Rec 2020 for monitoring and delivery. And how do you find out if it's P3 or Rec 2020? You have to consult your studio spec for guidance on that. So that's our first topic, and I'm going to let AB take it away. So AB, have at it.
All right. Thank you, Tom, and thank you all for attending. So as Tom mentioned, the guideline used to be that try and work in PQ as much as you can. And I think a lot of people came back to us saying, oh yeah, but I prefer to work in other ways and so on. So we thought we should, sort of set that straight. Now, typically when you set up your project in the color corrector, you have three main parts to your color pipeline. So you have an input where you define what your source is, whether, what kind of camera material that is, or, whether it's CG or whatever. And then you have a way to set up your workspace or your timeline. And, when we said work in PQ as much as you can, a lot of people said, yeah, that means you have to set up my workspace as PQ. We think there are a lot of benefits in doing that, and I'll let Greg speak to that. But working in PQ does give you all that headroom, and there are benefits to that. But we totally respect the fact that you have your preferences and things you're familiar with. But then once you've set up your workspace and you do start grading and creating your images, you then have to finally output PQ to the display, as well as when you finally render it, they have to be rendered in PQ. This is critical. The other alternative is to leave your workspace or your timeline as the in the log or whatever format that you prefer or that you're comfortable with, and then just ensure that your final output is PQ, which is extremely critical. So having your input and your workspace in a log type workspace is perfectly acceptable. Greg, what are your thoughts on working in PQ, right from your grading all the way to output? You've had so many years of experience with this.
Yes, AB, I think all colorists would probably agree that the important thing for them is to work quickly. And so we all develop ways that we find work for us to be efficient. And we have tools that we use, and we expect them to give us a result that we're trying to create. But each grading tool affects contrast curves differently and at different points in the curve. And lots of people are used to working in log, and that's perfectly fine. Working in PQ may feel a little different at first, but then so does HDR grading anyway. And you can certainly get used to that. For me, it feels more natural to manipulate the PQ curve while I'm monitoring in PQ, and usually I'm using base grade and base light, which is designed to sort of manipulate a PQ curve. But working in log is fine, and if a colorist prefers that, there's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly all right, and as long as that the path that they've got is not destructive in any way, that there's no clipping of highlights or crushing of blacks, then it's perfectly good to work in that as well.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, so I think, that's a very key point. The goal of all our recommendations is to ensure that you bring in your material, your high quality acquisition or your high quality raw material. You bring it in without any kind of degradation or any compression or clipping into your workspace, and then be able to work with it in the best way possible. So you don't want to lose any of that high dynamic range or wide color gamut that you have in your source. Another question that we got this morning was about ACEs. So I just wanted to quickly touch on that. You can absolutely work in ACEs if that is what you prefer, and all the color correctors now support that. Dolby Vision completely is in favor of you working in ACEs if you're comfortable with that. If it works for you, totally no problems in that. So let's quickly jump into Resolve and take a quick look at what this means from a color pipeline perspective. So we have Resolve set up here, and again, we're using it purely as an example. You would find a similar functionality, similar possibilities in all the other color correctors that we support. So in the Resolve Color Managed option that we have in the color management section, you can go and set up your input for whatever camera type you have. For example, if it was Alexa, if it was shot on Alexa and you're working with ARRI RAW, you could bring it in as your Alexa V3 and log ARRI log, but then you have a choice of whether you want to leave the color space of the timeline in your target delivery format, which we'll talk about in a second. It could be either P3 or Rec 2020, and you have to make sure that your EOTF is selected or set to PQ or SD2084. Now, the option you have at this point is saying that, yeah, I would prefer to leave my workspace, my timeline in the same log that I'm that my source material is in, and that is perfectly acceptable as well. So there's nothing wrong in leaving it like that. So this, deciding on what this field shows pretty much decides how you feel when you color correct, how the controls respond, and so on. And that is totally fine as long as all your material remains intact and nothing is lost. All right, so let's jump to the next topic.
Great. Thanks, AB. So just to remind everybody, I'm shocked we don't have any questions yet. And I've confirmed through a test that the question area is working. So if you do have a question, please type it in the questions tab and try to fit it all into one box instead of sending multiple questions on the same topic if you can. It makes it easier to organize. Great. Okay, I see one comment. So far everything makes sense. Great. That's good to hear. All right. So the next topic is very similar and in that same area that we're going to be focusing in on, and that's making sure that you set up the output color space correctly and that you handle deliverable correctly in terms of both image and XML, and that they match. One of the common errors that we see when in terms of handling Rec 2020 content is someone will deliver an image to, say, QC or mastering that says it's a Rec 2020 image, but the XML will say it's P3D65, and there's confusion, and people have to make phone calls and try to sort it out. So essentially, the new guidance is offering more definitive steps that you can take to make sure if you are delivering a P3 project that your color gamut matches your XML, and where does that conversion happen and how do you manage that conversion. So I'll let AB pick it up from here, but just when you go look at the best practices, this is section 3.2, making sure, especially when working in Rec 2020, that you are doing it correctly.
All right. So to start off, let me just quickly, start with talking about the color gamuts themselves. So as you can see, if you look at the CIE chromacity diagram, you will see that the Rec 709 is that smallest triangle there. P3 is the the sort of the larger one, and Rec 2020 is the largest. And since it is a broadcast standard, it is an ITU standard. Dolby generally recommends that you should work in P3, but then you may get a request from a studio saying that you need to make a Rec 2020 deliverable. In that case, I do get a lot of people calling up, and saying, how do we do that? Because you said work in P3, deliver P3. What happens in this case? So in terms of the different scenarios, in terms of the different options for delivery, you can work in P3, monitor in P3, and deliver P3, which is a perfectly straightforward approach. If you decide to work in Rec 2020, and that is a very common direction that a lot of facilities and colorists take. You just have to make sure that you limit your working color gamut on the color corrector to P3, so that you do not go out beyond P3 into Rec 2020, and thus, this may risk, in terms of what you see on your monitor, because displays may not be capable of displaying the entire 2020 gamut, and different panels may do different things in terms of how much of Rec 2020 they can display, and that can sometimes cause problems. So if you limit your working color gamut to P3, then you know that you are safe. You're not going beyond P3, and therefore your display will be capable of displaying all the colors that you're working with, and then you would monitor it in 2020 and then deliver 2020. Again, not a problem. Pretty straightforward. What happens is when you work in P3, you were expecting to make a P3 deliverable. Maybe you had to do a P3 deliverable, but in addition, you were sort of requested by another studio or something saying, can you also give us a Rec 2020 version? In which case, there are two things you have to do. The first thing is you have to take your P3 render and do a color space conversion on that and make it Rec 2020. And you can do this either on the color corrector itself, or you could use a mastering system like ColorFront or Transcoder. And once you've converted your images, the next thing that you have to be mindful about is that you also have to make a change inside the XML. Now, inside the Dolby Vision XML, there is a section called color encoding, and the first part of that has a set of primaries. These primaries have to match your render. So if you remember, the Dolby Vision master or the Dolby Vision deliverable, the principal deliverable is an image sequence or an image component plus the XML. Now, when you send this pair, you have to make sure that the color primaries inside the XML match your render. And the primaries I have listed here. It's in the, it's easy to find. These are the P3 primaries. So if you're delivering a P3 render, you must make sure these numbers show up inside the XML. If you're delivering 2020, make sure these are the numbers that you see inside the XML. And we will be looking at how to do this conversion to the XML later. I'll be using Metafire to do that, because that's a very straightforward, very simple way of doing it. But there are other ways to do it on the color corrector as well. So just to quickly sum up, we generally recommend working in P3, but you may be requested or you may be asked to deliver 2020 deliverables. In that case, make sure your picture is rendered or converted to Rec 2020, and also make sure your XML matches the picture.
So can we go back to the color corrector, AB, and also discuss limiting the gamut to P3 and working in Rec 2020 on your monitor?
Sure, absolutely. So if you go back to the color management in Resolve, again, I'm using the same Resolve as my example. So I have P3D65. So in this case, like I said, it's pretty straightforward. You would set up your mastering monitor when you do your Dolby Vision to P3 as well, and this works pretty well. There are no problems there. Now, in the events that you're working in Rec 2020, you would have to change this to Rec 2020 so that it's sending out Rec 2020, and you would also have to change your mastering monitor accordingly. But then you would make sure that you limit your working color gamut to P3D65. Now, this is in the past we used to do this with lookup tables. So at the end of your color grading pipeline, you would use a lookup table that would limit your color gamut. But now that is a feature that's available to you in the color corrector, so it makes it a lot easier. Again, it's not just in Resolve. You will see that all color correction systems now have a provision to do this because there are a lot of people that may be using this as their workflow.
So generally speaking, AB, just to paraphrase what you're saying, you can set up your monitor for Rec 2020. You can limit your gamut here. When you export the video file, it will be Rec 2020, and the
Correct.
XML will also be a Rec 2020. So you won't need to do any specific conversions.
Correct. And that's what I said. If you're working entirely in P3 or entirely in 2020, you should not have any problems. I think the questions usually come up when studios ask you to deliver both. So you're working on a project and you need to make two versions of it, right? And then that's when the questions come up as to how you do that. Yeah.
And is there a reason, this is a question that just came in, is there a reason for limiting and working in P3 because of this current screen technology limitations?
Correct. That's exactly why it is. If you limit your working gamut to P3, then you know that you're not trying to push the monitor to display these colors that are beyond P3. Monitors work in Rec 2020, but they may not be able to display much beyond the P3 gamut. And that is where the concern comes up, is that what am I looking at? Am I looking at the colors correctly? And we also found that if I took it to another display that does something slightly different, you may see a slight variation in the colors. And that's why we tell people to generally limit your working gamut to P3.
Yes, and there is another workflow, Gavin. Maybe you could just speak about using a LUT that takes you to the monitor primaries and how you work in that situation.
Yeah, you can put a limiting LUT on. So if you measure the native primaries of your monitor in CM4, you can create a custom mastering display. So that mastering display can hold the native primaries of that monitor. So all you have to do is measure the monitor, get the XY coordinates from your measurements, and then create a custom mastering display for that. Not all partner products are compatible with or can create a custom mastering display. So if that's a feature that you want to use, contact that partner directly and ask for that feature request.
Right. And I think, guys, the biggest point we're trying to make here is not to 100% educate you on how you should work in Rec 2020 or what your choice is. That's really up to you. What we're trying to let you know is the most common error that we see is when someone delivers Rec 2020 video with an XML that says P3 D65, and there's a mismatch, and which one is correct? And then the QC house or the studio has to go back and ask questions, and was the file converted? So it's important that you manage both ends of the process. If you are delivering in Rec 2020, how you create that Rec 2020 video, whether you're limiting the color gamut to P3 inside the color corrector, or whether you're using a LUT that's calibrated to the primaries of the monitor, et cetera, it's more about delivering the appropriate Dolby Vision XML that matches and that there isn't any confusion. So I hope that clears it up. AB, do you have anything else to add? There's a few questions, and there's a lot of comments on this topic. So I think this has the most confusion. One of them was around using a 1000 nit version, limiting to the 2020 primaries. When would someone use the unconstrained version, and or is there a recommendation around that piece?
Yeah, so if you go to again, most color correctors, when you select the PQ option, you have a set of you either can set it to the full PQ, which is sort of unlimited, or you can limit it to one of these options. Now, I have met both sides. I mean, I've met colorists who hate this idea of limiting it, and I've met colorists who think it's a good idea because you are then safe. So if you set a 1000 nit limit, and let's say you're delivering a 1000 nit Dolby Vision master to a studio, you know then that nothing will go above that, and that is probably a good safety net for you to have, so that you know that I accidentally don't push my luminance beyond that. In some cases, with for example, with film scans, you may have noise or dirt or dust, and in the scans, and that could become pure white or very close to it, which means you may have specks of dust in your picture that go up to 5,000 or 6,000 nits, or maybe even all the way up to 10,000. So having this limiter makes sure that, or ensures that nothing goes above 1,000 and that you do not get rejects from QC. But otherwise, you can very well work with the the unlimited option. Remember that the limiters that you have here, they do a very hard clip. So they don't roll off or anything. It's a very hard clip. So that's probably why a lot of colorists don't like the idea. But again, totally up to you. And I would recommend that you test it out. Try out both options and see which one works for you, and then use that.
Great. Awesome. We're going to be covering how to update the XML shortly with Metafire, so stay tuned on that. I know a couple people are interested in how do you manage the XML portion, so we're going to be showing you that in a few minutes. Our next topic is another common question that we get, and that is dealing with full range versus legal range. And several people I know here in Hollywood have lost hair over this topic. Or hair's turned gray, maybe is a better way to say it. But we're just basically trying to remind everyone that the Dolby Vision workflow is recommended to be done with a full range HDR master, and then doing the Dolby Vision metadata analysis and trims, and doing the 100 nit trim using a 100 nit SDR monitor set to full range as well. If you do want to create legal range deliverables, there are steps you can take to manage that, typically after the Dolby Vision metadata process has been created, and I'll let AB pick it up from here.
Okay, so I've come across this problem at a lot of facilities, especially facilities that are very familiar with working, for broadcast. And what happens there is they mostly work in legal range. So when Dolby comes in and says, okay, you have to start creating Dolby Vision in full range, that's when the question comes up, oh, how does that work and why not? And so these diagrams pretty much explain what the full range versus legal range is. So most of the processing inside the color corrector typically happens in full range. You do not remove anything. You work with that full 1023 or 4092 range. What happens is sometimes you may have to output legal range deliverables, maybe your SDR, or you may even get a request to deliver Dolby Vision masters in the legal range. In that case, our recommendation is always, create the content in full range, monitor in full range, make sure that you're working with, all of that dynamic range, all the headroom while you create, and then make a scaled deliverable from that. So when you say that I have one deliverable that needs to be legal range, just scale it down, make it legal. Ensure that you're using the best scaling available. Do not clip, do not compress in a bad way where you lose valuable detail in the highlights and in the blacks. Make sure that, and all the color correctors and mastering systems today support that. But in addition to the scaling of the video, make sure that you have made the change inside the XML. So back to the color encoding section inside the XML, there is an entry that talks about signal range. And if your signal range says computer, that indicates it's full range. Again, this is what we prefer. This is what the Dolby Vision specification is. But then if you have to make a deliverable in legal range, just make sure that along with your video, you also update your XML to show video instead of computer, thus making the XML compatible with the video. So just keep that in mind. Yeah, the most important thing to me is that you always monitor in full range, and when you scale down to legal, make sure that you're not clipping it, and you try and preserve as much of the details in the blacks and highlights as possible. All right.
Great. And
any questions? Yeah.
we'll be talking a little bit more about if you are modifying the HDR image and you need to modify the XML, we'll be covering that in the Metaphire section, correct, AB?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, of course, there are a lot of things you can do with Metaphire, but we'll be talking specifically about, how to check an XML and then how to make a change from, let's say, P3 to 2020. Yeah, we'll look at that.
Great. So our next topic is somewhat related to, again, HDR grading in general, but then also how does the mapping occur using Dolby Vision? And it's dealing with text and titles inside your master workflow. And it's one that we get a lot of questions about, right, AB?
Yeah, a lot of people get a little confused about, what we should do for text in HDR.
Great. So take it away.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that confusion stems from your past experience working with text in SDR. So in SDR, when you're working with a range of 0 to 100 nits, it's relatively easy to set a value for the text. You can say that, I set my text at 80 nits or 90 nits, and that generally works for almost everything that I do. And that's, fairly reasonable to understand because, you're working with a limited range. If I set my text at about 80 nits, then even if my picture goes down to 50 or 60 or, goes up to 100, it doesn't look way too, out of place. But that's not the case in HDR. In HDR, you're now working with a much larger range in terms of dynamic range and luminance. And even if you are just working with a 1000 nit display, you suddenly have this wide range of possibilities in terms of what the background can be. And your text typically has to be, it has to blend correctly with the background. I mean, it can't be too bright, it can't be too dark, it can't be the same level of luminance, then it would disappear. So finding that magic number sometimes can be tricky. We also have this other common issue that we see where the graphics department creates titles in SDR. They do it in Gamma 2.4 or 2.2, and then they send those files over. Now that would work perfectly. So let's say I made something at, I don't know, approximately 900 code values. It would be, 70, 80, maybe 90 nits, and it would work in Gamma. But the moment you convert that to PQ, that'll end up being 5,000, maybe 6,000 nits, and that could completely break what you're doing. So you have to make sure that you create your titles in PQ, and then when you lay them onto your background or when you composite them, make sure you're monitoring it in PQ, either on an HDR monitor or at least on PQ scopes. And I made a quick example here just to show you what that feels like. Again, this is just to convey the idea. It's not true in terms of values. I understand that none of you are monitoring this in PQ. The webcam, the web conference service does not transmit PQ. So, but just to give you the idea, I have text here, and I have two different backgrounds. One of obviously a lot darker than the other. And then when I lay that on, let's say my first set of text is around 35 nits approximately in terms of the code values that I'm using. And you see that this seems, maybe I could manage with that, but this is definitely too dark. It'll look way too dark on that background. So if I make the text a little brighter, you see that, okay, this looks better, this could work, but then this has disappeared because it blends too much into the background. I can't do that. So I would have to make that brighter, but then this looks good now, but this doesn't. And again, you have to be mindful of the code values because you have to limit the brightness of the text to the maximum brightness of your display. Otherwise, you're putting text in there that you cannot see. So you have to be extremely careful about doing that. Let me just quickly jump into Resolve, show you that, and then we'll come back and talk about texted and textless. So I've got some text here, and I've just added that to this background layer. And you will see that if I go to the color corrector, and then if you look at the scopes here, I'm on these PQ scopes, 0 to 10,000 nits. I've set these two markers, one at 300 nits, which is this line. Yeah, I'm assuming you can see that. And the 1000 nit line, which is up there. Now, if I make my text brighter, you see that as I go really bright, again, you're looking at this as a simulation of PQ. It's not really PQ, but you see that if I go too bright, obviously that's way too bright. It's the brightest thing in my frame. That's probably not right. I would probably bring it down and position it somewhere here, right? And you think, okay, that's more like it. That works. So it's around, I would say, 300 or 400 nits. Now, if I take the same text and go into another layer, which has a much brighter background, you see that if I set the luminance to the same 300-400 nits, it's too dark. It blends in too much. I can't see it. So I would, make that brighter, maybe go all the way up to the peak luminance that I have available to me, which is about 1,000 nits in this case, and I would set it to that. And then you see, yeah, that works a lot better. So this is something that you have to be aware of, especially with principal titles, main titles. I have to be mindful of the background plate, and I have to make sure that I set my text relative to that. Subtitles are a slightly different. Yeah, sorry.
Just on the same topic, in your two examples where these titles are very different brightness, right. We've had some questions in the earlier webinar about how once you've done the Dolby Vision analysis and you're trimming at 100 nits, do those look different at 100 nits? So you might have to also make adjustments based on how it looks in HDR and how it also maps in SDR. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. Again, one of the things that you have to remember is that, when you run the analysis, you get three numbers: the minimum, average, and max. If you can keep your text around the average value, then you will see that you will not see a significant shift when you do the mapping. But if they are, if, for example, if the text is the brightest thing in the frame, for example, sometimes you see that when you map down, the mapping system is trying to set where that luminance is. So for example, if the brightest thing in my picture is 1,000 nits and I have my text at 1,000 nits, when I scale down the picture to 100 nits, which is SDR, you will see that the picture sort of averages down to about 100, and you have all these different things at the same level. So then you will have to decide what you want to do. Do you want to make the picture darker or the text darker? That can sometimes be a creative decision that you have to make. But yes, you can adjust that using the trims.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, let me go. Okay, so another thing that again keeps coming up is with regard to texted and textless. So it's a very common request from studios that say that, okay, I want you to deliver the Dolby Vision Master with everything in it. It has got all the titles and text and graphics and effects and everything. But I also want you to send a textless version so that we can then take it to maybe other countries or make regional language versions from that. So when I have textless, I can then swap the text with something in a regional language or a specific language. And this is perfectly common, a perfectly valid request. The recommendation that we have to make at this point is that when you deliver the textless version or the textless master, make sure that you don't have to deliver a separate XML for that. And the reason for that is because, remember that no one is going to see these shots without text. The only purpose that it serves, that these shots are delivered for, is so that you can replace the text that you have in the master with something else. which means whenever this is being used as a Dolby Vision deliverable or as a Dolby Vision master, it will always have some text in some form. In that case, you would use the very same XML that you have in this case and just swap out the shots, replace the text, reapply the same XML, and everything should work. All right. I hope that is clear. But yeah, I mean, there may be specific use cases where a studio insists and says, no, I want a separate XML. I would say absolutely go ahead and do that. But for all normal purposes, we don't think there's the need for a separate XML. All right. And just as a quick summary, again, just remember text needs special attention in HDR. You must ideally create them in PQ, or if not, at least lay them or insert them in PQ so that you're aware of what level of brightness they sit in the picture. You may have to adjust the luminance of the text relative to the background, and always remember that if the text is the brightest thing in the picture or in the frame, that will affect the metadata, and that could affect the way the mapping happens. And you may then have to go and adjust those trims to get the sort of the relative luminance of the text in context to the background. All right. And of course, textless elements do not have to be delivered with a separate XML. The main master XML should work for that as well.
Great. So our next topic is related to text, and we actually had a question on this very topic of how would you deal with a second video track in, say, Resolve, where you have your text on the video layer 2, and one of the common errors that we see is people don't realize that unless you make a compound clip, you're not analyzing that second layer. You're only analyzing the first layer. So AB, take it away.
Yeah, so this is again specific to Resolve, and since we're showing Resolve, we thought we should talk about it because we do see this as a problem that comes up quite often. So what happens in Resolve is on the timeline, when you run an analysis, the analyzer only analyzes video layer 1. When you have multi-layer timelines, which interestingly is becoming a very common thing. Colorists today are being asked to do composites, and they have sky replacements and background replacements and all kinds of things coming in as separate layers. So in that case, what happens if you have multiple layers or even just one layer with text, the analyzer will not analyze that. In order to make it analyze it, you will have to combine the two. Now, of course, you can render it out and bring it back as a composite clip. You could even flatten it, make it a single layer, or you could use a compound clip where it will combine it, make it a single clip, and then when you run the analysis, it will actually take the text into account. Or whatever other layers that you have. The benefit of the compound clip is that you can also open it up again and go and adjust things. You can make changes. Unlike if you rendered it or flattened it, in which case it's done, it's baked in, you cannot make any changes. So always remember that you will have to do that on Resolve, at least for the time being. I think they may have an improvement coming at some point. All right, so just be aware of that. Were there any questions related to that? Or?
So there's actually, if we could, let's jump back to the dealing with text again, because there's two more questions related to text. So one is, when doing the Dolby HDR analysis, should this be completed with the text disabled for best performance? And I think the answer to that is no, right, AB?
Correct. I would always run the analysis with everything in it. Unless you're absolutely sure that adding the text will not change the L1, in which case you're okay to do that. I tell people that if you can keep I think I just mentioned that earlier, if you can keep the value of the average, value of the text somewhere around where the average picture level is, you should be okay. But as the text gets brighter and brighter, and especially if it becomes the brightest thing in the frame, then you may have a problem if you are, adding text or removing text from the metadata, from the picture.
Right. And then this one, I just wanted to answer it on mic as well, because you said not to do it, but let's just be clear. So just to be clear, if textless content is basically added at the end of the texted program, in other words, they add those shots on the end. Are you saying
timeline, yep.
the XML, that you should not have values, L1 values and trims on those shots at the end of the XML? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because even if you had an XML for that, when it comes to the final master or when you're encoding, you would have to cut that off. You would have to truncate that. So I guess you could create an XML for the length of the picture, the actual length of picture, and then have those extra shots at the end. And obviously, when you are mastering, making a version or encoding or something, you would just take that off. You could use that for delivery, but the XML would be for the length of picture, right?
And what you're saying, AB, is the original analysis and trim that you did over the English language texted area for that shot,
right?
That will be the value that's used when the Japanese text is overlaid on the new shot, right?
Exactly.
When it's replaced.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what would happen is on the timeline, I think, in this case, you would put all the textless shots here at the end of the timeline.
Right.
That's what they put black in and just put. Yeah, you don't need metadata for that.
It'll just get thrown away, is what you're saying.
Exactly. You wouldn't be able to use it anyway. Yeah.
Okay. Hopefully that clears it up.
Yeah. This is Greg. The answer that I had typed in there was you could copy and paste the L1 and L2 from each of those texted shots into the textless at the end. Then you've delivered that, and whoever is dealing with the XMLs and the deliverables afterwards could do the chopping it off, right?
Yeah. And then
exactly. Whoever's managing that.
Oh wow! Abe's launching Apple TV for us.
I know, it's like, how do I turn it off? Forget it. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Hey, so here's another one. Is it possible to use a subtitle layer in Resolve while in Dolby Vision, or does each subtitle have to be an individual image file in PQ?
Yeah, so you're probably referring to this, which is adding a subtitle using the subtitle feature. Again, if you do that, the metadata does not take that into account. If you want if your subtitles are unique in some way and you want that to figure in the mapping, then you have to add it on as a separate layer. And again, the simplest way to do that is to find sort of the an average picture level and set that, because otherwise then you'll have to go and adjust the luminance level of your subtitles as well, which can become a very manual process.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, let's move on. That's where we're at for questions right now. Number 6 is we'd like to walk you through some basics of using Metafire, which is a command line tool that comes as part of the professional tools. And it's a really good practice to use once you've created your XML and you want to check it after you've exported. So AB, take it away.
All right. So when you become a licensed facility for Dolby Vision, you get access to the Dolby Vision professional tools. Typically, that comes in as a zip file, and that zip file will have all the different versions in it. You have Windows, Mac, and Linux. And you have to install that on your system to make it work. And the moment you do that, it will put it into a location depending on which platform. And on the Mac here, I have it in user local bin. And if you go there, you will see oh, did I go somewhere else? I did. I think I did. Let me see. Okay. Yeah. And if you look there, you will see a Dolby Vision folder. So it has a folder that says Dolby Vision professional tools. And inside there, you have all the tools that we use. So the tool that we're looking at today is Metaphire, and it's a very good tool to have, especially because it will check your metadata and give you a summary, a quick report. And also it flags major errors, and that's extremely useful. So I have an XML here that that I created on Resolve. I'm just going to drag that in there and run the validate option in Metaphire. Again, all of the commands associated with Metaphire are described in the documentation that comes with it. So all of this is in there, but I thought it's a good thing to talk about. So the Metaphire validation is a quick way to check your XML. If you remember, the XML is a very extensive, very large text document. Going through it and trying to find something can be a little difficult, especially if you're trying to find if there are any errors and so on. So the Metaphire check, the validation, is a very quick way to do that. And again, you see here, it pretty much summarizes the whole XML. And I always tell people in my training to have the delivery spec in hand and make sure that you're delivering the XML according to spec, right? So it tells you that this one is version 4.0 metadata. So this is the new Dolby Vision version. It's it's been around for quite some time, but again, studios are in the process of transitioning to this new format. Again, our advice is always make sure you check with the studio before you create and deliver anything. It tells you what the aspect ratio is, so that's something that's very important as well. L5 metadata, you have to specify that correctly to make sure that you're blanking information, whatever that is, it's set correctly. It tells you the frame rate, tells you what the mastering monitor is, so you know that it was set correctly. This is usually set before you run your analysis. It has to be set manually. So once you set that, it gets recorded inside the XML. It also does a lot of validation in terms of syntax. So if we found that people who are in the habit of opening up an XML and editing it manually tend to sometimes make mistakes or whatever. So the validation always checks and lets you know that you haven't deleted something or introduced any illegal characters or things like that, which is a good thing. It also specifies that the level 6 metadata, which is your max fall, max CLL, is present, but the values are 0, 0, which means there are no real values. This sometimes is a request from studios. So if that happens, let's say the studio says that when you deliver the Dolby Vision metadata, make sure that you have max CLL, max fall values. Then you have to go and acquire those values somehow and then enter it here before you deliver. The color encoding section here, it says P3D65. So this is what we spoke about earlier. Let's hypothetically, this is a situation where I was told that we have to deliver P3D65, and so I worked in P3D65 and delivered it as such, and my XML is correct right now. But then at the last minute, maybe they say that you also have to do a Rec 2020 deliverable, in which case you can then modify it, as I will show you in a second, and then we will change that to Rec 2020. Some more validation, it also goes and validates things like dissolves, because as you know, when you do a dissolve in Dolby Vision, it converts from the per shot metadata that you normally have to per frame metadata. And this section pretty much validates that to make sure that again, everything is in order, no mistakes. It tells you the number of shots, it tells you the frame range. The frame range could become an issue. For example, some studios specify that you have to start at 1 hour on the timeline. Some studios say that you have to start at 0. This is a place to confirm that you've got that right. If not, you may have to go and offset your XML to whatever the spec is. It tells you how many L2 and L8 trims are. You're all familiar with L2s in version 2.9. Version 4.0 introduces something called L8, which are all the new controls that you have in the new version. Again, it tells you how many trims were done. So that's a good way to validate and check that. Again, all the levels of metadata are checked and validated. And then at the end, it gives you some warnings. The first one is with regard to the backward compatible 2.9 metadata. We'll talk about that briefly at the end as well. But when you create metadata in 4.0, you can also derive automatically a backward compatible 2.9 for all the older devices out there, for the legacy devices out there. Again, that's something we can talk about. Another thing, it tells you that there are 36 shots that contain identical L8 levels or L8 values. And the reason this happened is because I was doing this quickly. I just did a trim for one shot and copied it across the timeline. And this is common, it happens, but it tells you that there are identical values. Identical level 8 values are perfectly acceptable. Identical L1 values, there are some limits. If you refer to the best practices document, it will talk about that. I'm not going to go into that right now, but yeah, something to keep in mind. So let's now quickly convert this XML to Rec 2020, as we discussed. So I run a command called color encoding. And here I specify that, I want 2020. And again, like before, I just drag and drop my XML in there. And when I run it, you say that, yeah, it's updated it to 2020. So if I now run my validation again, whenever I make a change to the XML, I always run validate so that I know that it's okay and that everything is in order. And you can again run that. You will now see, if you look at the previous validation, you will see that my color encoding says P3D65. If you now go down here and run the validation again, you will see that our new XML now says Rec 2020. So it's fairly simple. And one of the benefits of doing this with Metafire is that it also records revision history. So if you open up the XML and look at it, you will see that it maintains a history of all the changes that were made, and that's usually a good thing when delivering to studios, so they can keep a track of all the changes that were made. Okay. Any questions?
Cool. So one just topic, AB, where do you find the documentation on the professional tools and specifically Metafire? I think you covered it, but just remind us.
Good question. It's when you install the application on your computer, it also installs the manual. If you look at the zip file, it always comes with the release notes, but the user guide is installed with the application. So you will always get that PDF. And I think it's also there on our website.
Great. Another question that's related to the professional tools is, let's say I want to generate the MaxFall and MaxCLL for my Dolby Vision project, and I want to insert that into the Dolby Vision XML. What programs would you do? How would you do that?
Okay, so you can do that, on a transcoder or Clipster or things like that. But you have an application. We have a tool called CM Analyze. CM Analyze could go in and run an analysis on your on the media, on your TIFF sequence, for example, and generate the MaxCLL MaxFall for you. It will generate a new XML which has the MaxCLL MaxFall. You can then copy that into your main XML. That's one way to do it.
Okay.
And Resolve does not do it as a separate process. But interestingly, when you create an IMF in Resolve, it actually generates that and puts it inside the XML that's inside the IMF. Anyway, that's I can if you can message us separately and I can walk you through that. But CM Analyze could help you do that.
You can also set MaxFall and MaxCLL in the encoder when you're encoding for Blu-ray.
Right.
Thank you, Gavin. Another question is the validation report you generated, AB, can that be saved?
Yes, you can print that to a text file. Again, I think that is a feature now in Metafire. I mean, I used to just copy paste that into a document, but you can. Yeah, you can.
Okay.
You can print that to a text file.
Great. All right, we just have a few more
in
quick
Linux
topics.
or Mac, you could do that in the terminal. So.
Okay, great. And just a couple more quick topics. Let's jump back to the slides. Hopefully this training is useful to you. And if you're interested in more training, number one, if you are already a certified facility and you find yourself with time during this crazy quarantine world we live in at the moment, we will be offering what we call remote certification trainings, very similar to this, where we do it over web conference. And it's roughly a 3-hour program where we cover everything from color grading to mastering, packaging, QC, etc. So if you're not a certified facility and you'd like information about becoming certified, please email myself, tom.graham@Dolby, and/or if you're located outside of the Americas, you can email Ian Lowe. We're offering this new remote certification program at a very reduced price that allows you to go through the training, especially given that we're all sort of isolated, and it's a pretty cool program. So we've had some great success with that. Next slide, AB. Great. And so we thought we would just touch on Dolby Vision 4.0 briefly. We covered it quite extensively in the December webinar. And there's a couple updates. People are asking in the chat, what's the plan for studios to start accepting 4.0? And the answer, another question was, is 4.0 in beta? So essentially, 4.0 is it's out there in many of the tools, and this is a list of the tools that are supporting Dolby Vision 4.0 and to what extent they are supporting Dolby Vision 4.0. And you should contact your individual studio to see where they are in accepting Dolby Vision 4.0 masters. Some are accepting 4.0, some are not. And so it's an individual answer to that question. I will tell you that since our December meeting, there are some new updates. Autodesk has released their new version of Flame called 2021. And although it's not fully certified yet by Dolby, it's in what I would call Dolby Vision beta version. You are able to create 4.0 projects, and you're able to also import and edit metadata on existing projects. So it's quite a useful tool for mastering and finishing when it comes fully on board. It also has a fully integrated luster color correction system. ColorFront has added some new functionality in transcoder that allows you to update a 2.9 XML in 4.0, basically using Metafire, so you have to have Metafire on your system. And Roden Schwartz Clipster also now is going to be releasing support for custom displays in 4.0. Gavin, could you just give us a quick overview of custom displays?
Yeah, so in 4.0, one of the features that we enable are the ability to create a custom mastering or custom target display. And what that enables you to do on the mastering display side, you can create, let's say, a 1600 nit mastering display, something that's not in the list. You can then choose to set it up as 1600 nits peak and whatever that black level is. It also gives you the ability to use custom primaries. So doing that, what you would do is you would measure the monitor's native primaries that are viewable, and then you can put those XY coordinates in the in the mastering display specifications, and that'll carry through. For target displays, it's the same. You can create a custom target display. Most of the time, you'll only create the target display by changing the peak luminance and black level. So say a studio requested you deliver a 800 nit HDR 10 deliverable. You can render that out using a custom display at 800 nits and whatever that black level is. So it gives you that flexibility.
Great. We got one other question here. I think we can move ahead on the slide. I think that's it for slides, correct, AB?
Yep, that's it.
Yeah. So one question that came in is, does the new Apple XDR monitor meet the Dolby Vision specification? So that's in general, we're working with Apple on going through some things. It looks like a very promising monitor. There has a lot of benefits. We're really excited about it. I think they're working on adding calibration to the monitor, and then also essentially some way to get SDI video into it. So I think it's hopeful. We don't have any sort of big announcement yet on that, but I know some people are testing it and working on it as we speak. So any other questions in the chat? Please send them in. We can take a few more. Got a few more minutes here if you do. We really appreciate you guys taking the time to join us tonight. Almost everybody stayed through the entire time, so that's fantastic. Hopefully this is helpful. We'd love to hear from you if there's more topics you'd like to cover. If these things are useful, I'll also ask, in the email we sent you with the invitation, there was a link to a survey. If you wouldn't mind taking 10 minutes or 5 minutes to fill out the survey, we'd love to hear from you too. So please do that for us. Does the new Asus monitor meet the specs, the Dolby specs too? Again, something to look at for certain. Again, does it meet the Dolby Vision minimum specifications? We don't actually certify or put a stamp of approval on a monitor. You should probably do some testing on it yourself and see if it works for you. But I believe the published specs that they share do meet that. Gavin, here's a question for you. Will there ever be a reverse Dolby trim analysis? Meaning SDR grade first.
Oh, to trim from SDR to HDR. We're looking at it in research. There's a lot of complications in doing that because of consumer TV compatibility with trimming up, because it won't work on. It's not backwards compatible. So yeah, we're looking at it from a research standpoint for new applications other than home deliverables.
Cool. Thanks, Gavin. Another question was, will there be a recording of this session? And the answer is yes. Best if you can download the handout now. Again, you can have the slides as a PDF, and you can also have the latest version of the Dolby Vision color grading best practices. If you're listening to this recording and you want Dolby Vision color grading best practices, you can go to our website under the Dolby Vision for Professionals tab to find that latest document. And the best practices is version 4.2, and it's dated, I believe, yesterday's date, April 22nd, 2020. So did I hear you correctly? Does Dolby not certify mastering monitors for Dolby Vision? Yes, that's technically correct. We don't certify specific monitors. And part of the reason is you could buy several of the same monitors, and each one of them may or may not meet the published Dolby Vision spec. So, you know, the basic Dolby Vision spec is 1,000 nits of peak brightness minimum, at least 200,000 to 1 contrast ratio, supports 100% of the P3 color gamut, and supports the EOTF PQ. So that's the starting point, and then you should do your own testing to find out if the monitor works to your liking and specifications from there. Hopefully that answers your question. Josh Pine says, we'd love to be able to load a Dolby XML analysis file into other third-party color correctors for further trimming. And the answer to that is, sounds good. Put the request in to your individual color partners so that they can implement that technology. You know, some do now, like I said, with Autodesk Flame, right, AB, that will be able to import metadata and allow you to re-edit and trim. Am I correct on that?
It should be. I mean, we haven't fully tested it, but yeah, that's where they're heading for sure.
Great. Awesome. Well, I think that's all the questions that we have. Again, we really want to thank you for coming. You know, if you have a further question, we'd love to answer it. So don't hesitate to reach out to us after the webinar. We're here, and we want to support you, especially in this difficult time. So, you know, thank you again for joining, everyone. Please be safe, and we'll hope to see you on the other side of this.
Thank you.